Hi, Simon.
Hi, Lisa. You know what? Tell me a story.
Jeez. Oh, God. Do you remember when you were a kid
I
begging
know.
for a story?
I was
Well,
just
you know
thinking
what?
about that.
Yeah, well, do you remember when we met with Mackenzie and she told us she's a voracious reader and she kind of was giving us some recommendations on things that she's been reading lately? I did pick up the book one of them that she mentioned called
Right.
Challenger, which is about the explosion in, I think it was 1986.
Of the space shuttle.
And
Yeah.
yes, and and when she described it, she said it starts with the disaster itself, because everybody knows that that's, well, most people know. And then it goes backwards and then it kind of builds a story and builds the case about the whole event and a little bit of like what went wrong, what could they have done better. And she's right. I mean, the language is beautiful and it's, I'm actually listening to it, not reading it. So, but it's like, it's very compelling. And it did make me think about like, what does make a good story? Like, I like those they're not all narrative is like that, where it's like starts with a disaster and then works back in time. A lot of like, even in TV shows, there might be flashbacks and flash forwarding, and like there's lots of
Sure.
different ways to tell a story. But that's what we're talking about today. Like, we just kind of get right into it, is like the art or the power of storytelling in marketing and why it matters.
Yeah. And I think a key thing, storytelling is great. And you can sit by a campfire and just tell rambly stories or ghost stories or, history stories or whatever. But when we do it in marketing, it's with intention, right? The goal is to like engage potential customers, prospects. And I think you have to have some structure. And then I think that's what will be interesting to talk about today, is different strategies around creating the structure for storytelling.
Yeah.
So
Well, I just want to mention one thing that I think earlier in my career, I wasn't really aware of that. And even earlier in my career, I was not a marketer. I was a designer. So I was just taking what somebody else gave me and then, making it pretty essentially, or organizing the information.
Sure.
So a little different. And later on, I began to realize not only is it powerful in communicating something to your customers, it's also powerful if you are trying to convey something internally. So if you are looking to get a budget, or, again, this might be more appropriate for a larger organization, but it's still like, if you build a story, usually with data, and this is like the Spaceship Challenger, the problem, like the people did not do a good job kind of conveying the gravity of launching in 27-degree weather, when literally they were like, we're not allowed to launch if it's below 54. And yet they did it anyway. And it's like, they didn't have enough, like, if they presented the data. And in fact, Edward Tufte, who is a kind of, he's all about storytelling with data. So look him up, Edward Tufte. He actually talks about that. If they had information, if they could convey the kind of gravity, then maybe that never would have happened. So anyway.
I bet that's the case in a lot of scenarios where if you just took the time, that's the other thing I think that happens, right? Is people don't take the time to either do the analysis or present. You're basically presenting a case. I mean, probably lawyers are a great example of a super structured storyteller.
They tell stories.
Yeah. And they get the jury or whoever to agree with their side of the argument or whatever. And I think that's probably not a bad model. It's a little too, firm and strict, if you will. But
how do you mean? What do you mean?
I mean, in that there are rules of engagement in a courtroom, right? What you can say, what you can't say, what's considered puffery or hyperbole, or when are you actually speaking for the witness or leading the witness? When are you, when are you, putting out a falsehood just so that you get a reaction kind of thing, and then an objection and all of that? It's more structured. I was thinking, though, what you were saying, too, is I feel when I started to learn about business and marketing and things like that, initially it was all about feature benefit. Like the conversation that senior level marketers were talking about was not storytelling, right? I think storytelling back then was what we joked about at the very beginning, which is tell me a story. It's like, oh, Robin Red Riding, whatever. But
Little Red Riding Hood.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I almost mixed that up with the Three Bears, and Goldilocks. But the idea was, okay, you have a feature, here's the benefit. And yeah, it was sort of customer centric and all of that, but no one talked about, like you were saying, it's like set it up, like give it some context, like where are we at, where do we want to get to, and then what's the sort of proof points and data and things behind that. So I think the other thing though with storytelling is it's almost out of control. Like there's everyone is telling a story now, right? Through social media and email and websites. And so then you have to be even better at crafting a great story.
Well, yeah. So it's more like I think there are messages overload because I think people are still bombarding us with features, and I don't know that that's the best way to grab people's attention. So if I think back in the Steve Jobs days at Apple, he was 100% a storyteller. Like he just got people on board that you're like, yes, I want 1,000 songs in my pocket. Like that was his story. It wasn't about,
plays music back
technical specs.
Yeah, the feature,
exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Has a repeat, rewind, Yeah.
You didn't talk about that. You get their attention by the story.
Another great Apple example that I always think about is what's on your laptop, right? They had that whole
What? I don't even know what you're talking about.
So they had a campaign about what was in your laptop, in the sense like what did you
no recollection
use it for?
Of this.
Oh, you don't?
There's an app for that, which I thought was also
part
clever.
Of the Think Different campaign. And it was part of the fact that they were focused.
So I don't know how effective it was.
Well, they were focused less about Office applications and really pushing creative, and the fact that computers weren't just for doing Word documents, word processing, but it was more than that. There was more power in the laptop. So you have to look at it.
I know. I missed that somehow. Maybe I was drunk. I had an old roommate that whenever we wouldn't remember anything, she'd be like, was I drunk? I don't drink, for the record. But
I was going to say, and now it's just like senior moments, but
well, I know. I definitely, there's things that I have large areas that I don't remember. And Rob's like, remember when and he has to go through this whole thing step by step explaining something. And I'm like, oh.
I wonder if that's because we're marketers and we're constantly filled with ideas.
We're bombarded by so much information that we can only hold on to so much.
We start jettisoning, stories, and
getting it out. Yeah.
Anyway,
I don't know. I was trying to think of some other examples because Apple is really notorious for good storytelling, and I'm trying to think of good campaigns too. I think there was one. Well, is this a story? Do you remember with it? This is more. It's like a marketing tactic. Do you remember with Old Spice, which was like old dad cologne that had a resurrection because they would create ads based on what people were saying in social media, and they just would immediately respond. That's not really a story. I mean, it becomes a story, like talking about how they did that, but it's not. Yeah.
Actually, one of the best storytelling in a commercial that I can think of are the Budweiser commercials with the horses and the dogs, where the dog goes out on the road and is waiting, and you're like, what is this dog looking for? Like, is it lost? Is it blah blah blah? And then you see the Clydesdales coming, and the Clydesdale is his friend. right? One of the
Yeah,
lead
it's
Clydesdale
cute.
pulling the Budweiser beer wagon or whatever. And
Uh-huh.
there's a whole series of those that they did over time, right? And
Yes.
everyone's like, oh, what a
Yeah.
cute, the puppy and the
Mhm.
horse, it's like,
Mhm.
so, I
But
mean,
I don't know. I mean, yes, you were like, "Oh, it's a nice story," but I don't know that that made me buy beer. Like whereas the Apple
no,
ones, it's like you're like, "I'm on board." Like
but maybe
I
it made you
want
feel
that.
better about drinking Budweiser. Right?
Yeah.
It's a brand,
Sure.
that one might have been a brand elevation or
Yeah.
brand consideration. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
So I
for,
think one of the things it's
for
emotion. It's like
sure.
it's does it kind of pull at that part of us that it becomes an emotional, not a logical purchase. Because if you're looking at the practical things, it's like, well, I actually this other thing is cheaper and can give me the same thing. So the iPod, Apple was not the first one to create something like that.
Right.
It's just they packaged it up in such a way that people were like, I have to have that,
I
and
mean,
it become a cult following.
exactly. Exactly. And I think there's storytelling in like volumes of stories, right? All the short stories that Apple created over time. There's also the like one offs, like really good, like again, something that really um, makes you feel some sort of emotion, compassion, um, there's, uh,
Well, you had an
and
example of your work now. Aren't you having
well,
to do storytelling where
yeah. So in a sense, I write grants for a nonprofit, and one of those things that we start with is the situation that we face today. The percentage of homelessness or challenges with low income and food insecurity, depending on the sort of focus. But the goal is to get someone interested, a grant issuer, whoever's going to award the money, to be
Mhm.
like, oh wow, this is a compelling, yeah, I get where we are now. This is a challenge that we all face, a community. This is something going on all around us and we need to solve it. You sort of rally everyone around that, and then the sort of next step is you say, then this is how we've been successful in the past, and you keep sort of supporting the initial story with the proof points of how good you are as an organization to solve this problem, how you're the right organization. And then ultimately you get sort of into the details and the weeds. It's like,
Mm.
these are the specific things that we would use the funding for in order to solve the problems and the solution that we defined above, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So it's very much, you want to, again, capture someone's emotion and get them on board. You're trying to galvanize them. You're trying to get them to
Y-
like pick up your banner, and march, with you, kind of thing.
yes. And I do think that there is a common almost like formula or what's the word I'm looking for? Like a structure. What were we calling it? A framework that you can
Framework. Yeah.
follow. Well, and so here it was that I was sort of kind of thinking that there are all these different scenarios where you've got a storytelling that it's for, I'm a business and I am trying to market to my customers, like, Apple's trying to sell an iPod. So I've got a story there. There's, Spaceship Challenger disaster where it's sort of an internal thing where I'm showing data and I need to tell a story with the data to show. That's sort of a different thing.
Right.
I also think of sales, like salespeople. If you're in an organization that has that type of a model,
Sure.
they're taught like there's various sales techniques, but it's like it kind of is storytelling. And like the things that I think are in common are this, like you set up the kind of the problem, if you will, or like stories of failure, I think is usually where a lot of these stories start. And you have to get people to be like, yeah, I feel that, I agree with that, that is my perception of the state of things today. You might be like, oh, there's so many things in the world, and you're like, yeah, totally, whatever the thing
Right.
is. Then the kind of this almost like a transformation, or like, what if you could da 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 da, and then solution, which is your offering, so that by
Right.
the end you're like, oh, but you gotta like, you could do that really dry, but it's not going to be as compelling as if you can have almost like a narrative for
Yeah.
it, and like how you can come about on the other end, and
Well,
how your solution will be helpful.
I mean, what you mentioned earlier about television and things like, I mean, this is your typical story arc, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Problem, then there's drama in the middle, and then there's some sort of resolution, happy or sad, but there's resolution. Obviously, if you're doing this for business, you want
Yeah.
happy, you want conversion. I was thinking
Yeah.
too, as you were talking, like, um, these don't have to be long and elaborate, right? You could be telling a story that builds that sort of trust, and it builds your brand. And basically, what that does is it builds memory. People remember your, window company or your doctor's office or your dental's office just because of that, making that connection and making something pop, specific sort of, like I'm saying, memory kind of idea,
Yeah, I think
memorable.
people, yeah, if it's tied to emotion, I think humans have a better way of retaining something than if it's again numbers and, speeds and feeds, if you will. Maybe that's why I don't remember that other one you were telling me about. Maybe it didn't resonate with me emotionally.
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of stories. And if that wasn't where you were in your life, right? You weren't looking for a computer, or you weren't shopping for beer, or, some of these things may
Sure.
not pop or stand out to you. I was thinking the other thing, and I think you touched on it, but the idea of, in a business, case studies, right? That's a perfect way to package up a story, right?
Yeah.
Is that you can introduce it in a small way, or you can tease it, if you will, on, say, your ads or your landing pages, if you're on your website, social media. But
Yeah.
you build out the full case studies, the ultimate in story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it takes into account all those pieces, right? A company was struggling with this, and they're a great company, but they needed a solution that helped them solve this big
Yeah.
problem.
See how
And
so and
then
so
and then
tripled
we
their
came in,
sales.
and yeah, exactly. And by implementing this solution, this service, this product, right?
Yep. Exactly. Well, so that is a good one. I don't know if everybody has case studies, if it's applicable to everyone.
But you might have customer references, customer testimonials, right? If you're a smaller company, you might be able to get something. I think about Yelp reviews, right? For local
Mm-hmm.
business or something.
Mm-hmm.
If you get a good one or a couple good ones, and it sort of lays out how you address a common customer need, customer pain point, as we would refer to it, right? That, I think, can be the same thing. You can tell a story with that.
Yeah. And I guess that's also the classic kind of hero's journey, too, from a broad sense. It's kind of like
Mm.
there's this problem, there's stakes, there's a struggle, and then they come out, unscathed at the end. And they've learned something along the way,
Uh,
like that's a classic story.
Hercules.
Well, like Lord of the Rings
Yeah.
or,
Any good story
yeah.
where someone's, changed. I think the other thing that you have to make sure, though, is that, you wouldn't use Lord of the Rings storytelling if it doesn't match your brand, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you're, I just, thinking about, a marketing services company, right? It probably is a little over the top to speak to it in the tone of, say, Mission Impossible, right? And, you know, Tom Cruise is going to come in and save your company by working with us, kind of concept that probably
Yeah.
wouldn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I
No, but I
mean,
also the like again the internal one I think is undervalued, where let's say you have a problem with customer support in your company and you
mm,
can't get people to change their behaviors. But if you set up a story where you're like, here we are today where we've got, 2-star reviews, negative sentiment on da 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 da, and it's like, and then you go through, here are, and then maybe you show, customer quotes that are like, I dealt with Sarah and she was so rude and da da da, whatever. Like you're setting up like this
She
dire
is rude,
thing,
isn't she?
and then you say, but then if we, and you might propose a solution that, like, I mean, I'm not bridging the gap really, but it's like internally it can be done where you start with this dire thing and you need to, it's like a persuasion. That's your
Right.
goal, is you're trying to persuade somebody to change their behaviors, whether that's an employee or a customer that you want them to buy something or whatever. Like you have to, if you string that along, then you will probably have a better outcome. So I did have to do this at a previous company of mine where we were watching our reviews go from, we had like thousands of reviews, but it went from like 4.2, 4.1, 4, 3.9. And when you get below that 4, everybody was freaking out. So I had to, and everybody was pointing fingers. So I basically I analyzed all of the responses that we were getting.
Yeah.
And then I basically presented it. And then like, this is what happens if you go down more and more and more. Like I had to kind of show how dire it was. And then I had to say, these are the two things. We have product issues and we have customer support issues. We have to address these things. And then I kind of spelled it all out. I got owners to agree to it. And then we had a plan on how we were going to change it. And it's like, I got kind of people on board to kind of help with that. So
right.
I think it's underutilized. And again, data, you shouldn't just be, I get so angry. I've said this before. If somebody just gives me, here's a table of a bunch of numbers on performance. And I'm like, this means nothing to me. Absolutely nothing. What does that tell me? What are you trying to tell me? Like, what should I do differently? Is there anything, should we spend more money? Should we not spend money? It's like, so you got to tell a story. You got to provide insights.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you get a lot of data and it is hard to figure out like, what is the trend? What's something that you're missing as far as like an insight and things like that. So I'll just throw this out there as a sort of sidebar. If you have a table, if you have a lot of data and you think somewhere in there is rationale for this story that you want to tell, stick it in AI. Ask AI, like ChatGPT or whatever you use.
Again, make sure that your company is okay. Like it,
so two things. Yeah. Make sure you either use a version of an AI tool that is walled off from the rest of the world before you put company data up there, or use.
Well, you still got to get, I would say, make sure that you have permission. If you're using data, like that's
true. Okay.
Just be careful. Yeah.
You just put your Lindsay
in other words,
on.
yes, but also just think about like if I'm putting up, this was, our revenue, whatever, you're basically telling the AI to then tell other people that. So just keep that in mind. And certain organizations have certain policies, like, some of the companies I consult with, I'm allowed to use one thing, like it's like I can't do anything else. I could use something else in the hypothetical. Like if I'm like, can you give me some suggestions for this or that, even though I have this walled off version, I still would never mention its names. I would never provide any numbers or anything.
That's true. Yeah. And strip that stuff out of the data set just in case as well. But you're absolutely right. But what a long story short was that you can maybe gain some insights that way too, just to make sure that if you're just getting data. But I get what you're saying. It's like if you're working on a website or managing social media for a company or trying to just look at your reporting, the dashboards alone aren't telling a story usually. And you have to really think about, what story am I trying to tell? What does this information tell me?
So let's try to give some like practical advice on how somebody might do, because it's kind of daunting. And to me, it's been an evolution that I've over my career. I still don't think I'm great at it, to be honest, but I strive to tell a story. And so how would you recommend people get started on something like this, and what kinds of things should they apply it to?
Well, and we touched on a simple formula. I think you said it. Really starting with the problem statement, and then essentially saying, what's at risk if you don't address this, and then what are those things that probably need to get resolved that sort of flows into some sort of solution or
Hmm.
recommendation, and then ultimately I think it's good to set out how is this going to change, transform, what are your metrics going to be that are going to improve. I would say, it is daunting if you think, well, I'm not creative, I'm not, I don't write well, or I don't tell a good story. I think still just laying it out simply, and then even if it's just something you use verbally to structure a conversation with a customer or an internal person, like you were saying. And I would say for me, I know the hardest thing is shiny object. I get distracted, and a lot of stuff also is in my head, and I don't put it down on paper like I should. If I put it down on paper, all of a sudden I'm going to be like, oh, I see the story. I see the outline of the story.
Yes.
And you
And
can,
this is where ChatGPT or whatever could be really helpful. Because if you're like, this is what my problem is, this is what my solution is, help me build a narrative. I don't see why it couldn't help with that. And then I would also weave in some data points. Because if you're just
absolutely.
claiming something as like, this is the disaster that we're in right now, it's like you need to have some sort of a validation of that's really true. Like
Right.
I've done consulting for a bunch of B2B companies, and let's say they're offering some sort of a technology that can help streamline. So like you have to say there's this classic illustration of all of the marketing technologies, and 10, 15 years ago it was still a lot. It was hundreds. Now it's like tens of thousands. It's like
Right.
crazy, just a bunch of logos of all the companies that do stuff.
Well, because they
So
all do now become
a
very
very specific
niche.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but you start with like, this is the landscape, and people are like, oh yeah, like they know it's if you're in marketing or in marketing technology, you've seen that chart.
Hmm.
And so if you start with that and say like, how do you make sense of all of this noise? Everybody's claiming to be, this expert. And it's like, how do you whatever. And it's just like, you can start like with something like it's a real thing
Hmm.
that people are going to be nodding. They're like, yeah, I know, it's kind of crazy. And so, and then it's like, and then, do you want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on these technologies, because that's something that is true too. And then you go meet, us. We don't do, we don't charge you tons of money. Like you have to think about like, what are the like problems of that thing? And
Well,
then what your solution is.
you just made me think. The key thing that if you're feeding this into AI, or if you're just thinking about it in this framework on a piece of paper, what is different? What are your differentiators, right? Like you just said, we don't charge hundreds of thousands or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
what is your
Or it's simple to
differentiator?
set up. No.
This is again sort of a random non
We
sequitur
always,
sidebar.
we
Yeah.
always, everything overlaps, like it's not a straightforward
So
thing.
on Sunday we came home and our air conditioner was making the craziest sound. And I was like, oh, this is not good. And our air conditioner's still under warranty for parts, but not for labor. And I called on Monday morning. They could at first they're like, oh, it's going to be 10 days before someone can come out. And well, 10 days, like
I'm hot.
I live it. We work at home. What are you talking about? And so then they said, no, we can come out Wednesday. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's better. And then I immediately stopped and I went, wait a minute. I bet I can figure this out, or at least I can, you know, solve the problem. So anyway, long story short, figured out what the problem was, right, by doing some assessment. And this is more sort of how I'm tying this to, this
Story.
this storytelling is like, if you're struggling with figuring out what your problem is, do some assessment. You mentioned it. Do some research. Look at data sources for other areas of, and use that to inform your problem
I
statement.
see. So you're saying like maybe I don't know what is the problem that I'm solving for if you don't know, like you got to
Right.
reverse engineer
Or
it kind of. What are the problems that people are having?
yeah,
Yeah.
my air
That's
conditioner,
smart.
it could be one of three things. Two of them cost, $25 and one costs $2,000, right? Obviously, I don't want a
You'll
problem
start with the
to
the low ones. Yeah.
exactly. It
Mhm.
turns out, yeah, for $25, overnight shipping, 4 a.m., arrived on my door at 5:30 in the morning. Thank you, Amazon. And I was able to replace the part. This also
Does
got
it
me
work?
thinking it works fine. It
Great.
was a
And
capacitor.
you canceled your appointment.
I canceled my appointment, but then I said, and a friend of mine also was like, said the same thing I had thought earlier. I'm like, I should just have a company that for $100, I'll replace this capacitor for you. And that is the majority of what goes
The
out
problem
on
is,
people's air conditioners when they stop
oh
working.
my
And
gosh.
these companies, they want to charge you $200 to come out. And then if they don't have the part, they have to order it, and then they have to come back and they charge you another $200. So it's like $400 worth of service. You may not have to pay for the part, and I thought this is like, but what if it's something more serious, right? And that's
Then you
the
refer them.
challenge. Yeah, then you refer them or something. But
Maybe you can
anyway,
get a referral fee. That's a good
so
little business.
how could I create a story around this for a business? Yeah, exactly. So
And that's something that it's like, so this, all right. So now I was like trying to like, I felt like we were summarizing, but one of the things that you are bringing up is like, is your problem a chronic long-term thing or is it an acute problem? So I think if it's acute, like my air conditioner went out, that might be different. That's like, oh my God, I need it now. So I
right.
don't know what your story would be
Well,
there, other than like cheap, like advertise.
no, it would be 24-hour service, right? I could be in it within a day, assuming I could get a part,
And you're not
right?
on vacation.
And I'm not on vacation, but saying that if
Yeah.
it could be a quicker fix than waiting 10 days to
Yep.
have your AC repaired.
And people trying to milk you.
Right.
Yeah. I love it.
So, but you're right. It could a chronic business story or something too.
That's really where I think the storytelling comes into play. It's like this is like an ongoing thing that it's a headache of yours that it's like enough that it's annoying, but you haven't done anything about it. So you got to get people to act.
And I think I just realized it's sort of like we all actually can tell stories. And I don't mean that in the sort of white lie or lie sense, but when you want to convince your friends where you're going to go to dinner, like you might, in a sense, you're telling a story, right? There's some storytelling there. Oh, I remember when the last time we had pizza and it was really good and we went here, and yeah, I mean, I think
so. Now you're getting into persuasion. I think it's
which is an element of your story, right?
It is, and then building trust. I think that's another thing too. If you just kind of like claim something, but I was just thinking yesterday there was something came up where we were trying to decide on two different things, and I honestly didn't have an opinion about it. So I pointed some things out. I was like, well, if we went this way, there's this to consider. If we went this way, there's this to consider. And so then that became the discussion of like, making a decision and again, I had no opinion. I just was, food for thought. Cause like, what's the criteria for decision making? Like you have to kind of have some rules of like, what's important to us. Is it just, oh, that sounds good? Or, like you have to have criteria, which maybe that's another topic. Decision making.
Maybe.
How do you? Yeah, I don't know.
That.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be
another topic.
The whole Racy and Daisy thing.
True. So that will leave you with that cliffhanger if you don't know what that is.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
I mean, I was just thinking, start small, pick something that you can, you have some passion about, create that emotional connection with somebody, to get some and differentiate, right? And, start there, right?
Yep.
I think in the end of the day, everyone wants to be remembered or remember something. So
Good
as
place to
we,
stop.
yeah, as we say, from tangents to tactics.
It's mostly marketing.